My dad made us practice being dead. The funeral director asked why my obituary already had a publication date. I was standing right in front of him, 16 years old and very much alive, but the document in his hand said I'd died 3 days ago from a sudden heart defect. My name was printed in that formal font they use for death announcements. Lillian Cartwright, beloved daughter, taken too soon. The director's face went pale when I pointed at my own name and asked what the hell he was talking about. He stammered something about a mistake, about how this shouldn't have been filed yet, about how my father had submitted all the paperwork in advance for efficiency. I grabbed the paper from his hands and saw the date. My death was scheduled for this coming Friday at approximately 3 p.m. The cause was already determined. The flowers were already ordered. Someone had planned my death down to the minute, and I was supposed to die in 72 hours. I ran out of that funeral home and didn't stop until I reached the parking lot where Dad's truck sat idling. He was on his phone, laughing about something, completely relaxed. When he saw me holding the paper, his face changed. Not shocked, not confused, just annoyed, like I'd discovered his surprise party before the big reveal. He told me to get in the truck and I did, because I was still trying to process what I'd just seen. We drove in silence for 10 minutes before he finally spoke. He said I wasn't supposed to see that yet, that he was going to explain everything at dinner tonight, that I'd ruined the surprise. The way he said it made my blood freeze, like my scheduled death was a vacation he'd been planning, like I should apologize for finding out early. Dad pulled into a rest stop and turned off the engine. He explained it like he was teaching me to drive. Simple steps, logical progression, nothing to be afraid of. We were going to stage my death from a heart condition I'd supposedly had since birth. I'd lie in a coffin during a closed viewing while he collected sympathy and insurance money. Then I'd disappear for 6 months, grow my hair out, come back with a new name and social security number he'd already purchased. I'd done this before, he said. 3 times, actually. I just didn't remember because I'd been younger. My brother Owen had done it twice. My sister Iris was scheduled for her 4th death next month. This was just how our family made money. This was normal for us. This was love. I stared at him and tried to remember being someone else, having a different name, dying and coming back. Nothing surfaced except this creeping feeling that my childhood memories had gaps I'd never noticed before Dad said the practice sessions would start tonight. I needed to learn how to hold my breath for extended periods, how to slow my heart rate, how to stay perfectly still even when people were crying over my body. He'd done this with my older siblings, and they'd all survived just fine. Well, most of them had. He said that last part, like it was a minor detail. Like acceptable losses in a business venture, I asked what he meant by most of them, and he started the truck. We had work to do. Questions could wait. The house looked different when we pulled into the driveway. I'd grown up here, but suddenly I was seeing it through new eyes, noticing things I'd ignored before. The basement windows were blacked out. There were deadbolts on the outside of bedroom doors. The backyard had patches where grass wouldn't grow, rectangular shapes that could have been anything but probably weren't flower beds. Dad led me inside, and his wife Karen was waiting in the kitchen. Not my mom, Karen. My actual mother had died when I was 6. At least that's what I'd always been told. Karen had married Dad when I was 7 and brought her own 2 kids into the family. Now I was wondering if my mother had really died or if she'd just escaped. Karen handed me a protein shake and told me to drink it. She said it would help with the breath control training, something about increasing oxygen efficiency in my blood. I asked what was really in it, and she smiled like I'd told a joke. Dad went down to the basement and came back with a large plastic storage container, the kind you'd use for Christmas decorations. Inside were folders organized by name. My name, Owen's name, Iris's name, 3 other names I didn't recognize. Each folder contained death certificates, obituaries, insurance claim forms, sympathy cards, and photographs of children lying in caskets. The children looked asleep, peaceful, believable. Dad said these were his success stories. His proof of concept. I flipped through my folder and found 4 different obituaries for girls named Lily, all with different last names, all dying between ages 6 and 14. Same face in the photos. My face. Owen came home from school and barely glanced at me before heading to his room. I followed him and shut the door behind us. I asked him if he knew about the death staging, and he looked at me like I was stupid. Of course he knew. He'd died twice, once at age 8 and once at age 12. He showed me the scars on his chest from where Dad had applied prosthetic wounds for a car accident scenario. The makeup had given him chemical burns, but it photographed well, so Dad considered it a success. Owen said the first time was scary, but the second time was easier because he knew what to expect. The hardest part was staying still when people touched the casket or when distant relatives wailed over his body. But you got used to it. You got used to everything eventually. Iris was 13 and she'd died 3 times already. I found her in the garage practicing her death pose, lying on a yoga mat with her hands folded over her chest. She could hold her breath for almost 4 minutes now. Dad had been training her since she was 5, starting with 30-second holds and gradually building up. She said her first death had been from drowning, her second from a sudden allergic reaction, her third from falling off a horse. Each scenario had its own challenges, its own required stillness technique. The drowning had been hardest because they'd used a waterlogged effect in the casket, and she'd had to resist every instinct to move when the cold seeped through her clothes. But Dad said she'd performed beautifully. The insurance company never suspected a thing. That night, Dad gathered all 6 of us in the basement. Me, Owen, Iris, and Karen's 2 kids, Sophie and Miles. He explained that we were a family business, that what we did wasn't wrong because insurance companies were scams anyway, designed to take money from regular people and never pay out. We were just gaming a corrupt system. Besides, the funeral industry was built on grief exploitation, so we were actually exposing their greed by forcing them to deliver services they charged obscene amounts for. His logic was twisted, but he delivered it with such confidence that I could see Sophie and Miles nodding along. They'd heard this speech before. They believed it. Dad showed us videos on his laptop, training footage of each of us at different ages, lying in practice coffins in the basement, holding our breath while he timed us with a stopwatch. I watched myself at age 7, at age 9, at age 11, performing the same death drill over and over. In some videos, I was crying. In others, I looked drugged. Dad explained that he'd used mild sedatives in the beginning to help us stay calm, but we'd all graduated to doing it naturally now. He was proud of our progress. He showed us footage of actual viewings, hidden camera angles, capturing mourners filing past caskets containing us. The grief was real, even if the death wasn't people sobbing, touching the casket, leaving flowers. Dad had monetized human empathy and turned his children into the product. The practice session started with breathing exercises. Dad made us lie on the basement floor and time our breath holds while Karen monitored our heart rates with a pulse oximeter. My baseline was 2 minutes before I started feeling desperate for air. Dad said that wasn't good enough. For a convincing death, I needed to stay motionless for at least 5 minutes at a time because mourners would linger, would watch for any sign of movement. Any twitch, any chest rise, any flutter of eyelids would destroy the illusion. We practiced until midnight. By the end, I could hold for 3 minutes, but Dad said we had 2 days to get me to 5. The consequences of failure weren't explicitly stated, but I understood them from the way Dad looked at the folder with the 3 extra names, the siblings I didn't remember. I asked Dad about those names while Karen was getting us water. Who was Rebecca? Who was Danielle? Who was Theo? Dad's face went blank. That same annoyed expression from the funeral home parking lot. He said those were complications, children who couldn't perform under pressure, children who'd struggled with the stillness requirement. Rebecca had panicked during her viewing and started moving mourners had seen. The whole operation had nearly been exposed. Dad had to make a choice. He'd given her something to help her stay calm permanently. Danielle had tried to run away and tell a teacher. Theo had threatened to go to the police. Dad kept their death certificates in the folder as a reminder that some deaths had to become real to protect the family business. He said this like it was a reasonable management decision. I spent that night lying awake, staring at my ceiling, trying to remember being Rebecca or Danielle, trying to remember if I'd had other names, other faces, other lives before this one. The memories wouldn't come, but the feeling was there, this deep unease that I'd forgotten something crucial. Karen had said something earlier about the protein shake helping with oxygen efficiency. I'd seen her slip something into it from a small brown bottle she kept in her pocket. Maybe the drinks were why I couldn't remember. Maybe forgetting was part of the process. Maybe I'd been someone else and Lily was just the latest version, the current iteration of whatever child Dad needed to kill next for money. The next morning, Dad took me to a storage unit across town. Unit 42, climate-controlled, paid through a shell company registered in Delaware. Inside were filing cabinets full of documents, each drawer labeled with policy numbers and payout dates. Dad pulled out a folder and showed me the business model. Each child could be killed approximately every 2 years, with different policy providers and different causes of death to avoid pattern recognition. The key was moving to new states, establishing residency, getting the kids enrolled in school, and building a paper trail before staging the death. We'd lived in 7 states in the past 10 years. I'd thought we moved because of Dad's sales job. Now I understood we moved to stay ahead of investigation. The storage unit also contained props, coffins in different sizes, folded and stored flat, prosthetic wounds made from medical-grade silicone makeup kits designed for mortuary use, fake medical records from hospitals that didn't exist. Dad had been perfecting this operation for 15 years since Owen was born. He'd started with smaller cons, staging car accidents for insurance fraud, but realized children generated more sympathy and fewer questions. A grieving father was above suspicion. People brought him casseroles and offered to pay for funeral expenses. Churches held fundraisers. Strangers donated thousands to memorial funds that went straight into Dad's offshore accounts. He'd made almost $2 million killing his children on paper and collecting their insurance payouts. I found photographs hidden in the back of one filing cabinet. Children I didn't recognize, lying in caskets, definitely not sleeping. These weren't the practice photos or the performance photos. These were different. The bodies were wrong. Too still. Too gray. I confronted Dad and he snatched the photos from my hands. He said those were complications from the early days, before he'd perfected the sedation ratios, before he'd learned the right chemical combinations. Some children had been given too much help staying still. He'd learned from those mistakes. That's what made him good at this now. He knew exactly how much to give and when to stop. The photos went back into the cabinet and he locked it with a key he wore around his neck. He said, I didn't need to worry about that. I was strong enough to do this without pharmaceutical assistance. That afternoon, we practiced in the basement coffin. Dad had me lie down and he closed the lid, leaving a tiny gap for air. I could hear him setting up his video equipment, preparing to record my practice session. The darkness was total. The space was tight. My chest felt compressed, even though there was technically enough room. Dad's voice came through muffled, telling me to begin the breath hold. I filled my lungs and stopped breathing. 10 seconds, 20, 30. My heart rate accelerated. 40 seconds, 50. My body started screaming for air. At 1 minute, I heard footsteps above me. Dad pacing, making mourner sounds, testing my ability to stay still under pressure. At 90 seconds, I almost broke. At 2 minutes, I gasped and Dad opened the lid, disappointed. We'd try again. We'd try until I got it right. Karen brought dinner to the basement. Sandwiches and those protein shakes. I refused the drink, and she said that was my choice, but it would make everything harder. Sophie and Miles drank theirs without question. They'd been in this family longer than I had since Karen married Dad 7 years ago. I asked Sophie how many times she'd died, and she said 4. The first time she'd been 8, and terrified. Now at 15, she barely felt anything when she lay in the coffin. She'd learned to go somewhere else in her mind, to float above the fear. She offered to teach me her technique, but warned that it took practice. Miles had died 3 times, and he said the worst part was coming back, having to be someone new, having to learn new social cues and pretend you'd always been that person. He'd been Dylan before he was Miles. Before that, he'd been Caleb. He couldn't remember his original name. Karen said that was healthy, that forgetting was a gift. That night, I found Owen in his room with a shoebox full of IDs, driver's licenses and student IDs with his face but different names, different birth dates, different addresses. He'd been Owen for 3 years now, the longest he'd maintained a single identity. Before that, he'd been Lucas, and before that, Nathan, and before that, a name he wouldn't tell me because he said saying it out loud made it too real. He showed me a photo of a little boy who looked like him but younger, softer. That was his brother, his real brother from before Karen and Dad got married. That brother had died during a practice session when Owen was 9. Actually died. Dad had buried him in the backyard and told the family he'd run away. Owen had watched from his bedroom window as Dad dug the hole. He'd never forgotten the sound of the shovel hitting dirt, the shape of the small body wrapped in blankets. He kept the photo to remember that some deaths weren't performances. I asked Owen why he didn't run, why he didn't tell someone, why he stayed in this house knowing what Dad had done. He said he'd thought about it every day for years. But where would he go? He had no legal identity outside the one Dad created for him. No birth certificate in his real name. No social security number that wasn't fraudulent. He technically died 3 years ago, according to government records. If he went to the police, he'd have to prove he existed, prove he was who he claimed to be, and all the evidence of his previous identities was stored in that locked filing cabinet in the storage unit. Plus Dad had connections. People who'd helped him move bodies, people who'd provided fake documents, people who'd be very interested in keeping Owen quiet. Running wasn't the freedom I thought it was. Running was just trading one coffin for another. The second day of practice was worse. Dad increased the difficulty, making me hold my breath while he played audio of people crying, while Karen touched my face checking for breath, while Iris stood next to the coffin whispering that I needed to do better or I'd end up like Rebecca. I lasted 4 minutes before I broke. Dad said it was progress, but not enough. We practiced for 6 hours straight, break between sessions, until my lips turned blue and Karen had to step in. She gave me that protein shake, and this time I drank it, because I needed something to make the panic stop. Within 20 minutes, I felt floaty, distant, like my body belonged to someone else. Dad opened the coffin lid, and I stayed perfectly still even though I was conscious. He timed me, 7 minutes without moving. He called it a breakthrough. I woke up on the basement floor hours later with no memory of how I got there. The others were eating dinner upstairs, and I could hear them laughing. Normal family sounds. I checked my arms for needle marks, but found nothing. Whatever Karen had put in that drink was oral, not injected, which meant I'd voluntarily taken it. Dad came down and helped me stand. He said I'd done well, that the viewing was tomorrow and I was ready. We'd use a mild sedative to take the edge off my nerves, but I'd proven I could stay still on my own. He was proud. He hugged me, and I felt my skin crawl, because this man had killed 3 of his children and was planning to fake kill me for money, and he believed this was love. His definition of love was so broken that murder and insurance fraud felt like family bonding. That night, I tried to call the police from my bedroom, but the phone line was dead. I tried to access the internet, but the Wi-Fi was password protected, and my laptop had been removed from my room. I checked the window and found it sealed shut with screws from the outside. My door had a deadbolt that locked from the hallway side. I was in a prison decorated like a bedroom, and I'd been living in it for years without noticing. I pounded on the door until Karen came. She said this was temporary, just for the 24 hours before the viewing, standard protocol to prevent last-minute panic. After tomorrow, I'd have full freedom again, at least until we moved to the next state and started preparing for the next death. She made it sound reasonable. She made imprisonment sound like safety. Morning came and Dad brought me a dress, dark blue, modest, something appropriate for a corpse. He'd already been to the funeral home to finalize arrangements. The viewing was scheduled for 3 p.m., exactly as the obituary had stated. My death was on schedule. Karen did my hair and makeup, making me look pale and peaceful. She'd done this enough times to know exactly how much blush to apply, how to position my hands, how to arrange my hair so it looked natural but stayed in place. She worked in silence, focused, professional. This was her job. She'd been doing it longer than she'd been my stepmother. Dad had met her at a mortuary services conference 8 years ago. She'd been working as a funeral makeup artist. They'd bonded over their shared understanding that death was a business opportunity. The basement coffin was replaced with a real one from the funeral home, delivered that morning on the pretense that Dad wanted to see his daughter one last time before the public viewing. The delivery men didn't question it. Grief made people illogical. Dad gave me the protein shake with the special ingredient, and I drank it because I didn't have a choice. The floating feeling came faster this time. Karen positioned me in the coffin, and I felt her arranging my dress, my hands, my hair. Dad leaned over and whispered that I just needed to stay still for 90 minutes. That's how long the viewing would last. Then it would be over, and I could come back. He kissed my forehead and closed the lid, and I was alone in the dark with my slowing heartbeat and my manufactured peace. The funeral home smelled like lilies and carpet cleaner. I could hear it through the coffin, Voices in the hallway. Someone directing traffic. Someone asking about parking. The service was starting. People were filing in. I could hear their footsteps getting closer, their voices lowering as they approached my coffin. Dad's voice rose above the others, thanking people for coming, explaining how sudden this had been, how the heart condition had gone undetected until it was too late. His grief sounded genuine. Years of practice had made him a convincing actor. Someone touched the coffin, and I felt the vibration through the wood. A woman's voice said, I looked peaceful. Another voice said I was with the angels now. The lies built on lies until I couldn't tell where performance ended and reality began. Something went wrong at the 40-minute mark. The medication was wearing off faster than planned, and I could feel panic creeping back in. My body demanding air, even though I was breathing shallowly through my nose. I wanted to move, but I couldn't because someone was standing right next to the coffin, crying. Through the gap in the lid, I could see shadows shifting, shapes of people I didn't know mourning a girl they'd met once or twice at school, a girl who'd never been real. My fingers twitched. Just a small movement, but enough that Karen would notice if she was watching. I forced myself still and counted seconds, trying to make it to the 90-minute mark, 70 seconds per minute, 90 minutes total. I was only halfway through. I wasn't going to make it. And at the 60-minute mark, I heard a voice I recognized. Mrs. Brennan, my English teacher, talking to Dad about what a bright student I'd been, how much potential I'd had. Dad thanked her and said I'd loved her class. Then Mrs. Brennan said something that made the room go quiet. She said she'd been confused by the obituary's publication date, how it seemed to have been submitted before I'd died, how the newspaper had flagged it as unusual. Dad laughed it off, said he'd prepared the obituary in advance during the hospital stay, that he'd been told to expect the worst. Mrs. Brennan didn't sound convinced. She said the funeral director had mentioned the same thing, how all the paperwork seemed prearranged, how that wasn't typical procedure. She said it almost sounded planned. The room temperature dropped 20 degrees in the silence that followed. Dad recovered quickly, turning the accusation into misunderstanding, explaining grief brain and preparation, and how people cope differently. Mrs. Brennan apologized and moved away from the coffin. But the damage was done. I could hear whispers starting. People remembering other students who died suddenly in recent years. People putting together patterns they'd dismissed before someone mentioned Owen's supposed death 3 years ago, how the family had moved states shortly after. Someone else brought up Iris's death 2 years before that, how there had been questions about the insurance payout. The whispers grew louder, and Dad tried to redirect attention, asking people to respect this difficult time, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The viewing was falling apart. Karen appeared next to the coffin, and I heard her telling Dad they needed to end this now, that people were getting suspicious, that they should close the viewing early. Dad argued that stopping would look worse, that they had to see it through. Their whispered argument was barely audible, but I caught enough to understand they were panicking. This had never happened before. Their cons had always worked because people wanted to believe the grief was real. But Mrs. Brennan had broken the spell by asking obvious questions no one else had thought to ask. Without blind sympathy, the whole performance fell apart. Someone called the police to report suspicious circumstances. Someone else started filming on their phone. Everything Dad had built was collapsing in real time. I made a choice. I moved. Just a small movement, turning my head slightly, but enough that the person standing nearest gasped. Then I opened my eyes and sat up in the coffin while dozens of people screamed. The shock on Dad's face was worth every consequence that would follow. Karen tried to grab me, but I climbed out of the coffin and stood there in my funeral dress in front of 40 witnesses who'd just watched a corpse resurrect. Mrs. Brennan was the first to react, pulling out her phone and calling the police while positioning herself between me and Dad. Other people formed a barrier, protecting me from my own father while he stood there calculating his next move. But there was no move. The con was exposed. The witnesses were too many. The evidence was literally standing in the middle of the funeral home, breathing. The police arrived within minutes, and the funeral home became a crime scene. Dad tried to run, but 2 men from the viewing tackled him in the parking lot. Karen was arrested, trying to leave through the back exit. Officers separated all of us kids, taking statements, trying to understand what they'd just witnessed. I told them everything. The storage unit, the fake deaths, the insurance fraud, the children who'd disappeared. Owen corroborated my story and showed them his collection of fake IDs. Iris broke down and admitted she'd died 3 times and didn't know who she was anymore. Sophie and Miles confirmed that Karen had been running the same operation before she'd married Dad, that she had 2 other children from a previous marriage who'd also died multiple times for money. The operation was bigger than anyone had suspected. The storage unit was raided that evening. Police found the filing cabinets, the coffins, the prosthetic wounds, and the photographs. The photographs of children who died for real, not in performance. The medical examiner identified 7 children whose deaths had been staged but had become permanent through overdose or accident or murder. Rebecca was buried in a park 3 states away. Danielle had been cremated and her ashes dumped in a river. Theo was in an unmarked grave in Dad's childhood hometown. 4 others had never been found. The investigation expanded into 5 states, involving federal agencies, uncovering a network of funeral directors and insurance agents who'd been complicit in the fraud. Dad and Karen had been running this operation with help, people who'd looked the other way for cash payments. The trial lasted 6 months. Dad represented himself and tried to argue that he'd been helping his children learn valuable skills, that the insurance money had supported the family, that no one had been hurt except those who'd been too weak to perform. The prosecutor showed the photographs of dead children to the jury, showed the medical records indicating cause of death as sedative overdose, showed the bank records proving Dad had collected over $2 million in fraudulent insurance claims. Showed my testimony, Owen's testimony, Iris's testimony, all of us explaining what it felt like to practice dying, to lie in coffins while strangers mourned, to forget our original names because we'd been so many different people. The jury deliberated for 2 hours, guilty on all counts, multiple life sentences, no possibility of parole. Karen took a plea deal and testified against the network of accomplices in exchange for 20 years instead of life. She gave investigators names, locations, methods. She explained how they'd recruited children from foster care, kids who wouldn't be missed, kids who had no paper trail. She admitted she'd done this with her first husband before he'd gone to prison, that she'd brought her techniques to Dad, that together they'd perfected the operation. She showed no remorse during her testimony. She described killing children like it was quality control in a factory. The prosecutor asked if she felt anything for the victims, and she said they'd been compensated with food and shelter. She genuinely believed she'd provided a service. The media coverage was relentless. Our faces were everywhere, labeled as survivors, victims, miracles. Dad became the face of parental evil, the man who'd turned his children into commodities. Think pieces were written about insurance fraud, about funeral industry regulation, about how many children might be out there right now practicing death for their parents' profit. The story sparked investigations in 12 other states. 3 similar operations were uncovered, smaller in scale but identical in method. Parents were arrested. Children were rescued. The whole system that had enabled this, the insurance companies that hadn't asked questions, the funeral homes that had accepted cash payments, the officials who'd rubber-stamped death certificates without investigation, all of it was exposed and reformed. Dad's crime created policy changes that would protect future children, but it couldn't bring back the 7 who died in his practice sessions. I spent a year in therapy, trying to remember who I'd been before I was Lily. The therapist said I might never recover those memories, that trauma and medication had fragmented my identity beyond repair. I had vague impressions of other names, other houses, other schools, but nothing concrete. Owen was the same. He remembered being someone before Lucas, but couldn't access those memories fully. Iris had started having nightmares about drowning, about suffocating, about being buried alive. We were all broken in different ways, shaped by years of practicing death until we'd forgotten how to live. The state placed us in separate foster homes while they tried to determine our legal identities. Birth certificates were found for some of our original names, but matching us to those documents was complicated DNA tests, dental records, investigation into Dad's early years. It all took time. Some of us might never be officially recognized as our original selves. The storage unit contents were cataloged as evidence and eventually donated to a museum that focused on criminal psychology. The coffins, the makeup kits, the fake medical records, all of it preserved as a warning about what happens when parents view their children as assets instead of people. I visited the exhibit once and saw my practice videos playing on a loop, my 7-year-old face staring blankly while Dad's voice coached me to stay still, to stop breathing, to be convincing. Other visitors watched with horror. I watched with numbness. That little girl was me, but also wasn't. She died in every way that mattered. And I was whoever had been left behind after too many resurrections. The exhibit placard said this was about insurance fraud, but it was really about something darker. It was about parents who'd looked at their children and seen profit margins instead of human beings, who'd been willing to kill them over and over in practice and sometimes for real, because money mattered more than love. 2 years after the trial, I legally changed my name to something I chose myself. Not Lily, not Rebecca, not whoever I'd been before Dad had erased that person. Something new. Something that belonged only to me. Owen did the same. Iris took longer because she had more identities to mourn, more deaths to process. We stayed in contact through supervised meetings arranged by the state, bonded by shared trauma, but also by the understanding that we'd survived something most people couldn't comprehend. We'd practiced being dead so many times that being alive felt foreign. But we learned, slowly. We learned that breathing didn't have to be measured in seconds. That stillness wasn't a performance. That death was supposed to happen once, at the end, not repeatedly throughout childhood as a monetization strategy. Sophie and Miles were reunited with their biological father who'd been searching for them for 6 years. Karen had faked their deaths in a car accident during the divorce and had taken them underground. Their father had believed they were really gone, had mourned them, had tried to move on. Discovering they were alive broke him all over again. He'd lost years with them. They didn't remember him. Karen had erased him from their memories the same way she'd erased their original identities. The reunion was covered by local news as a happy ending, but there was nothing happy about a father meeting his teenage children who looked at him like a stranger. Some damage couldn't be repaired. Some deaths were permanent even when the body survived. I found out 3 years later that I'd been born Amanda Reese in Portland, Oregon. My mother had died of cancer when I was 4. Dad had been my biological father, but he'd already started his operation by then, already been planning to use me. I'd been Amanda until I was 6. Then I'd become Sarah, then Jessica, then Lily. 4 identities in 12 years. 4 deaths. 4 insurance payouts. 4 times Dad had looked at me and seen dollar signs instead of his daughter. The state located distant relatives who remembered Amanda, showed me photos of a little girl with my face but different eyes that still had light in them. They said I'd been happy then. I didn't remember being happy. I didn't remember being Amanda at all. That person had died in a way that couldn't be documented on a certificate, erased by repeated trauma until nothing of her remained. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.